At 1:20 p.m. on March 23, 2005, a massive explosion and fire erupted at the BP refinery in Texas City, Texas. The explosion killed 15 workers and injured 180 others, many of them seriously. The blast occurred at the isomerization or ISOM unit, which produces materials to boost the octane rating of gasoline. The explosion shattered windows in homes and businesses up to 3/4 of a mile away from the 1,200-acre refinery. As thick black smoke billowed from the plant, authorities instructed some 43,000 Texas City residents to stay indoors. The accident cost BP billions of dollars in victims' compensation, property damage, and lost production.
This investigation was the largest and most comprehensive investigation in the history of the Chemical Safety Board.
CSB Supervisory Investigator Don Holmstrom led a 2-year investigation to determine the root causes of the accident.
We interviewed over 370 witnesses. We looked at thousands of documents, literally millions of pages of documents, and we examined the plant, inspected over 40 pieces of instrumentation and equipment.
The investigation team examined a wide range of safety systems, practices, and standards, and looked at human factors such as fatigue and communication between operators. The board's report was released at a public meeting in Texas City on March 20, 2007. Then CSB Chairman Carolyn Merritt presided.
Many of you here tonight had family members or co-workers who were victims of this explosion. To all of you, I express my deepest condolences and sincere wishes that society never allows another accident like this to occur.
The tragedy at BP was the worst industrial accident in the United States in nearly 15 years. The CSB concluded that it was the result of organizational and safety deficiencies at all levels of the company.
As a former CSB chairperson, Carolyn Merritt stated, the problems that existed at BP Texas City were neither momentary nor superficial. They ran deep through that operation of a risk denial and a risk blindness that was not being addressed anywhere in the organization. Here's what the CSB discovered about the sequence of events that led up to one of the worst industrial accidents in U.S. history.
The following CSB computer animation depicts the sequence of events over an 11-hour period leading to the explosion at the BP Texas City refinery on March 23, 2005. Several units at the Texas City refinery had been shut down for lengthy maintenance projects, which required nearly 1,000 contractors to be on site along with BP employees. BP had positioned a number of portable trailers close to process units for the use of contractors and other maintenance workers. Over a period of months, BP had located 10 trailers for workers servicing the ultra-cracker unit, including a double-wide wood-frame trailer that contained 11 offices and was regularly used for meetings. Though these trailers were located near the isomerization unit, the occupants were not warned the ISOM unit was about to start up, a potentially hazardous operation. At 2:15 a.m. on March 23rd, overnight operators began introducing flammable liquid hydrocarbons, known as raffinate, into a 170-foot-tall raffinate splitter tower used to distill and separate gasoline components. Near the base of the tower, there was a single instrument that measured how much liquid was inside. It transmitted this information to a central control room located away from the ISOM unit. But this level indicator was not designed to measure liquid above the 9-foot mark. During normal operation, the tower was only supposed to contain about 6.5 feet of liquid. But during startups, operators routinely deviated from written procedures and filled the tower above the 9-foot mark, concerned that if the liquid level fluctuated too low, it would cause costly damage to the furnace. At 3:09 a.m., as the liquid neared the 8-foot mark, a high-level alarm activated and sounded in the control room. But a second high-level alarm, slightly further up the tower, failed to go off. By 3:30 a.m., the level indicator showed that liquid had filled the bottom 9 feet of the tower, and the feed was stopped. The CSB later estimated that the liquid was in fact at a height of 13 feet, but operators could not know the actual level because the indicator only measured up to 9 feet. The lead operator had been overseeing the startup from a satellite control room within the ISOM unit. At 5 a.m., he briefly updated the night board operator in the central control room about the startup activities. The lead operator then left the refinery early, an hour before the end of the shift. A new board operator arrived in the control room around 6 a.m. to start his 30th day in a row working a 12-hour shift. He spoke briefly with the departing night shift operator and then read the logbook to prepare for the startup. But the logbook did not clearly indicate how much liquid was already in the tower and equipment, and it left no instructions on routing of the liquid feed and products when the startup resumed. Instead, the control board operator only found a one-line logbook entry that said, ISOM brought in some RAF to unit to pack RAF with. At 7:15 a.m., the day shift supervisor arrived. Because he was more than an hour late, he received no formal briefing from personnel on the night shift about conditions in the ISOM unit. At 9:51 a.m., operators resumed the startup. They began recirculating the liquid feed and adding more liquid to the already overfilled tower. As new feed was added, startup procedures called for regulating the liquid level in the tower using the automatic level control valve. But the board operator and others had received conflicting instructions on routing the product. As a result, this critical valve was left closed for several hours, blocking the flow of liquid from the tower. A few minutes later, operators lit burners on the furnace to begin heating up the feed, part of the normal startup process. While the startup was underway, the day supervisor left the refinery on short notice just before 11 a.m. to attend to a family medical emergency. Contrary to BP's own procedures, no experienced supervisor was assigned to replace him. This left a single control board operator, now without a qualified supervisor, to run 3 refinery units, including the ISOM unit, which needed close attention. The refinery had eliminated a second board operator position following corporate budget cuts in 1999 after BP acquired Amoco. As the startup continued, the tower steadily filled with liquid, reaching a height of 98 feet shortly before noon, more than 15 times the normal level. But the improperly calibrated level indicator told operators in the control room that the liquid was at 8.4 feet and gradually falling. Furthermore, the control panel was not configured to clearly warn operators of the growing danger. It did not display flows into and out of the tower on the same screen, nor did it calculate the total liquid in the tower. Meanwhile, the maintenance contractors, who were not involved in the operation of the ISOM unit, left their work trailers to attend a company lunch, celebrating a month without a lost time injury. At 12:41 p.m., an alarm activated as the rising liquid compressed the gases remaining in the top of the tower. Unable to understand the source of the high pressure, operators opened a manual chain valve to vent gases to the unit's emergency relief system, a 1950s-era blowdown drum that vented vapor directly into the atmosphere. Operators also turned off 2 burners in the furnace to lower the temperature inside the tower, believing this would reduce the pressure. Nobody knew the tower was dangerously full. None of the operators knew of the catastrophe unfolding in the ISOM unit. As flammable hydrocarbons overfilled the blowdown drum, operators nearby saw a geyser of liquid and vapor erupt from the top of the stack. The equivalent of nearly a tanker truck full of hot gasoline fell to the ground and began forming a huge flammable vapor cloud. This scene, based on CSB computer modeling, shows how the vapor cloud expanded in just 90 seconds, engulfing the unit and the nearby trailers full of workers. About 25 feet from the base of the blowdown drum, 2 workers were parked in a pickup truck with the engine idling. As flammable vapor entered the air intake, the diesel engine began to race. The 2 workers fled, unable to shut off the engine. Moments later, witnesses saw the truck backfire and ignite the vapor cloud. Powerful explosions swept through the area. Computer modeling shows how the blast pressure wave accelerated through the ISOM unit, causing heavy destruction and igniting fires throughout the area. The workers inside the trailers were right in the path of the explosions. The fires continued to burn for hours. 12 of the 20 occupants of the double-wide trailer were killed, along with 3 workers in a trailer nearby. Dozens of others suffered serious burns, fractures, and other traumatic injuries. The wood and metal frame trailers were blown apart by the blasts. Firefighters struggled to rescue the injured and recover the victims. 50 large chemical storage tanks were damaged, and the ISOM unit remained shut down for more than 2 years.
In this insider-exclusive network TV special, Justice in America, BP's Texas City Disaster, our news team meets with Brent Kuhn, founder and CEO of the Brent Kuhn and Associates law firm, his co-counsel, Eric Newell, who both led the litigation against BP that killed 15 contract workers and injured hundreds more. We also meet with Don Holstrom, the former lead U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Board investigator, and T.J. Alds, the award-winning news journalist who covered the entire story. BP's compensation bill for the explosion at its Texas City refinery in 2005 was in excess of $2 billion. The Honorable Texas District Judge Susan Criss presided over the trial and the 4,000-plus legal claims arising from the BP refinery disaster in Texas City, Texas. Investigations into that disaster revealed a culture of complacency towards worker safety at that refinery, which contributed to the disaster. Worker fatigue resulting from excessive overtime hours was another problem cited. Here's Brent Kuhn, the founder of Brent Kuhn and Associates, who gives us an inside view of this entire case.
My name is Brent Kuhn. I'm a trial lawyer. I was lead counsel in the BP Texas City oil explosion. This case is over now. What we did learn from 3 years of very aggressive discovery in the case was that BP had a culture of safety management practices that left their employees at grave risk to being injured on the job. What I learned in this case was that here you had one of the largest corporations in the world, one of the oldest companies in the world. BP had existed since the late 1800s. A very sophisticated company with over 100,000 employees, generated $500 billion of annual revenue. And yet here they were running their refinery system in such a backwards manner, in such a antiquated manner, where they're running old equipment, running it into the ground, completely, I wouldn't say they were oblivious, but completely apathetic to the safety risks that were all around the workforce. You know, we were very lucky in this case that early on, one judge was assigned the responsibility to handle all of the issues associated to the explosion. Her name was Judge Susan Criss. She sat on, I believe it's 212th Judicial District Bench. She was very savvy. She had been with the prosecutor's office for a number of years, trying very high-profile cases, which I think tempered her and prepared her for a case that had international ramifications. She was very temperate, and she navigated an extraordinarily complex case through a very difficult process to ultimately obtain a final resolution for everyone involved. But the thing that's disillusioning is that corporate America, and not all of it per se, but particularly within the heavy industry and certainly in other areas, safety considerations that impact the bottom line. In other words, safety considerations that make them have to spend money are often ignored. They're aware of them. They know the importance of safety. It's not that they're ignorant of safety considerations. They make a conscious decision to bypass things that are very important for safety and for health. Very short-sighted way of dealing with operating facilities that have a lot of risk attached to them if you don't manage them properly.
Brent and Eric have earned reputations as unyielding trial lawyers who repeatedly represent individuals and families against big companies and the Goliaths of the world, and repeatedly win. The lessons learned from the BP Texas City event are a testament to the excellent investigative work that the Brent Kuhn law firm and the CSB performed and continues to do each and every day. They are dedicated to uncovering the hidden catastrophic factors that put our fellow citizens at risk and wreak havoc on an important sector of our economy. 14 years after the BP Texas City disaster, one of the deadliest industrial accidents in the history of the United States, there is still much to learn. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Houston, Texas. It is my great pleasure to introduce Brent Kuhn and Eric Newell to the show. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks.
Tell our audience a little bit about your firm. What's your firm do? What do you specialize in?
You know, we specialize in representing interests of persons and businesses that have been wronged. So it can be a plane crash. We represent the victims. It can be a refinery explosion. We represent the victims or their family members. It can be a business that's been tortiously interfered with by another company. All of it on the plaintiff side. That's what we do.
And when we talk about the plaintiff side, usually that's the little guy side.
It is a little guy side. And again, some of our businesses with small companies and stuff, but they're still the little guys even in the business world. But yeah, we represent the little guys.
You know, you could have been a lawyer for DuPont. You could have been a lawyer for British Petroleum, but you chose not to. Why?
I don't like them.
But why you don't like major corporations?
I really don't like the attitude of major corporations because I think that many of them, particularly in the heavy industry areas, there's a disrespect to the workforce. I grew up on the workforce side of it. I was a blue collar worker before I went to college and law school. Everyone in my family was. Most of my friends still are, and I understand how that industry operates and they're bottom line profit driven, and they do so with so much impunity that they sacrifice safety and health issues in the workforce that results in people dying and getting hurt when they shouldn't have had, which is unfortunately how we now make our living.
What about you, Eric? You're on the plaintiff side.
I'm on the plaintiff side. Just like Brent, I grew up blue collar. Both my grandfathers worked in the oil industry, and my grandfather's missing a finger because of that. And so you see that these workers come in, they try to provide for their families, and they work in dangerous environments, and they really shouldn't have to. It's unfortunate that they do, and when they do get hurt, we do our best to help them.
Right. This today we're here talking about the British Petroleum Texas City explosion.
Yes, sir.
Tell our audience a little bit about the facts of the case. What happened?
You know, the facts, we can spend all day. We don't have that much time, but it's egregious. Long story short, BP Texas City was one of the largest refineries in the country, maybe in the world. They had 30 operating units there. They encompassed over 1,000 acres of refining pipes, heat exchangers, all the other things you see at a refinery. One particular unit was being started up that day. It was an older unit. It had been shut down for some quick repairs and was coming back online that day. And when they started it up, there was an explosion. The explosion occurred for about 10 different reasons. Because that unit was old, they didn't have a recirculation system. Because it was old, a lot of the things weren't working right. Because it was old, the alarm systems that would have alerted people and give them time to get away were non-functioning. Because it was an old system, they were not required to have a safety flare, which units are now required to have. So basically, being an old grandfathered unit that didn't have to comply with new standards, a lot of things were wrong with it. And the culmination of all those things being in such poor condition resulted in a tragedy that killed 15 people.
And it injured hundreds more.
Hundreds more, many hundreds.
I mean, some of these people were seriously injured.
Yeah, burns, broken bones, all sorts of major injuries.
You know, did you find when you were litigating this case, did you find that BP had some sort of safety manual?
Oh yeah,
Which required them to inspect, you know, some of the the mechanical devices they had, and did they have records of checking this stuff or what?
A big part of what we did in that litigation is to piece together what happened, and one of my key roles was to put together what really happened out of about 7 million pages of documents that they handed us. You know, me and teams of lawyers went through them, and you start to piece together all of the things that they missed. There were so many of their own requirements that they didn't really follow. Maybe they paid lip service. They filled out the form, but they didn't really look at the dangers. And that's when we get into what we call process safety. And they were more interested in making sure people wore hard hats and Nomex, which is important, but it's not as important as making sure your plant doesn't blow up. And ultimately, they failed to look at the important things, in part because they're the expensive things. And that's ultimately why the plant blew up and killed 15 people and injured hundreds of others.
Yeah, you had mentioned in the documents you sent to us that there was this corporate risk versus reward, weighing what it would cost them, BP, in case someone was killed or injured, versus repairing and fixing and making the plant safer. What was that evidence that you found?
You know, Steve, in every case, particularly this one, what you have on the decision-making side of a company, particularly these refineries, on where they spend their money, is what they call a risk assessment. What is the risk to the company if they don't fix something? And what is the cost of fixing it? And they compare them. So they actually quantify that risk. They say, okay, the risk of something bad happening could involve the cost of the repair to the unit and the expenses associated with rebuilding it, as well as killing people or injuring them, and how much it would cost them. What is that risk? They measure that, and they come up with a number. They say the chances are 1 in 10 or 1 in 50 or whatever. And then they say, well, how much does it cost to fix it? And they look at that number, and they basically just do a plain simple math. Which one is cheaper, taking the risk or fixing the known problem? And if it's taking the risk, they consciously decide to take the risk, but it's not a risk they are taking. It's a risk they're taking for their employees. Those decision makers,
and they don't know about it.
Those decision makers and managers are not in that plant taking that risk of killing those people. They certainly don't tell those people that they've done a risk assessment on them and are taking that risk with other people's lives. And it's those people's lives that end up being lost. And management then has very little accountability other than having their insurance company write a check.
Right. How does a jury, when you provide this evidence, how does a jury look at this?
You know, it's shocking because almost everyone that we've dealt with, and we talked to these jurors when we, after the case is over, we also talked to a lot of people in practice of mock juries before we go to trial to get their feelings on these. The thing that we've seen is a consistent statement from these jurors at the end of these presentations is that very rarely do they believe that people that are working at these plants, the managers, they just find it hard to believe that they would make decisions to put profits over safety, that they would really look at it and say, it's going to be cheaper to take this chance. We may kill some people, but we'll take the chance. They just can't believe managers do that, but they do all the time.
What changes have been implemented as a result of this huge disaster?
I think one of the major changes in the industry, most of the people that were killed in the explosion were in a trailer sitting right next to the unit that exploded. And those trailers were just wooden trailers that basically disintegrated during this blast. And one major change has been the increased use of blast-resistant trailers in refineries.
Yeah, we've been somewhat successful. Again, the companies have to do this voluntarily, but we've done a pretty good job by exposing publicly what happened here at such a high level. We were able to get most plants to voluntarily take all of their trailers and put them off-site, where the people working in them are not immediately adjacent to these zones of danger. And that when they are, as Eric mentioned, they put them in containment buildings that are structurally have much more integrity and should be able to withstand a VC or a vapor cloud explosion.
What was the final result of the case?
So the final result were twofold. One is on the civil side, We were able to eventually settle every case. We had some of the cases went all the way to final closing arguments before they settled, but we were able to settle all the cases. Our firm personally oversaw the vast majority of the discovery in the case and most of the individual claims. And we were able to see all of those steered safely to a final resolution. And on the criminal side, we worked directly with the DOJ in bringing criminal charges against BP, and we were able to get a plea agreement with BP for 15 counts of felony manslaughter.
And they paid a $50 million fine?
They paid a $50 million fine on that. They paid a number of other fines to OSHA for an exhaustive list of violations. They paid many millions of dollars for reparations to the families. And they were also, as a condition of governmental involvement, went back and put in $1 billion in infrastructural improvements to the facility.
We have with us today the former lead investigator of the Chemical Safety Board, Don Holstrom, and we're going to bring him on right now. It is my great pleasure to introduce Don Holstrom to the show. Welcome to the show, Don.
Thank you.
Please tell our audience the role that you played in this investigation of this tremendous catastrophe.
I was a lead investigator for the U.S. Chemical Safety Board's investigation of the accident. We deployed in March 24th, 2005.
That was the next day.
That was the next day. And we conducted an investigation over the next 2 years that not only looked at the immediate causes of the accident on the day of the incident, but the precursors, cultural issues, and even the role of the BP Board of Directors in London.
But what sticks out in your mind about the way BP conducted their business and how this could have been prevented?
Well, one of the things that surprised us when we first started investigating, because I think our view was that BP had good process safety practices in their various plants across the country, was the serious management system deficiencies that we saw throughout all aspects of the events that led to this incident, including mechanical integrity issues, cultural issues, things that needed to be fixed that weren't fixed, instruments that were not available, issues related to fatigue of the workers involved in the filling of the ISOM tower on the day of the incident, the placement of trailers that were too close to the incident, and a number of previous history of accidents and fatalities at this plant that were unaddressed by first Amoco and then BP.
Let me ask you this question. How long were you with the CSB?
I worked at the CSB for 17 years.
So this was towards the middle of your career that you did this investigation?
It was towards the early to middle part of my career.
Have you seen a pattern of conduct of major corporations not following proper safety procedures because they're sacrificing the safety of the employees or contractors because they want to make more money?
Well, we certainly saw budget pressures, failure to invest in the plant, and production pressures play a role in the Texas City incident. Subsequent to that, we've seen similar events at other plants across the country when we've performed these investigations. And I think that the Texas City report and what came out of Texas City certainly helps identify cultural issues, like failure of leadership in safety culture to provide sufficient funding and resources to ensure major accident prevention systems are effective, is something that came out of that incident that we think is very important.
Does the CSB, besides investigating disasters, do they have the power to make changes in the way a company operates?
No, it doesn't. It's similar to the National Transportation Safety Board in the sense that the CSB investigates, does a scientific investigation, but it does more than that. It issues recommendations and follows up on those recommendations until completion to make sure that those actions are implemented, and uses its bully pulpit if a recommendation is not being responded to or was responded to inappropriately, and evaluates that through a vote of the board, which is on our website and made public and often publicized through press conferences and other means.
Who's supposed to be the enforcement arm of the recommendations that you make?
We have a recommendations program at the Chemical Safety Board. One exists to follow up on those recommendations, and ultimately it's the responsibility of the board to vote on those recommendations, on their status, and follow up on them to make sure and advocate for them as part of their role.
So, Brent, as a result of the recommendations, do you see a significant change in the petrochemical industry?
I love Don, but the answer is no. Particularly the last several years, these investigative boards, and CSB does the best job of any of them out there, but they can't make those companies behave if the companies choose not to. And unfortunately, politics has a lot to play with it. You see the gutting of a number of the EPA and other key important safety and health agencies out there based on the politics in the landscape. Is it a pro-business regime at the White House or a pro-worker? That's the bottom line with the politics that come into it. And so I think the CSB means very well. I think, as Don intimated, the best thing they do is when they point out very transparently what the company did wrong. What the company does with that information is something that we can't control. But at the end of the day, they're pretty effective at shaming them. It's called, I guess we used bully pulpit, but basically and that was our importance in getting documents out. The only thing that you can do with these companies is publicly embarrass them, because at the end of the day, their concern as a bottom line is that if we're getting truly effectively publicly shamed, it's hurting our brand. And we have to change some of our ways so that the public doesn't turn away from our brand and our product. And that's the thing that I try to do as a public policy advocate within our firm. That's one of the things that CSB has always done with the role that they play.
Did the CSB, when you were at it, did they ever receive anonymous whistleblower complaints?
Sure. In fact, we were there. We received, at BP Texas City, we received information about 2 other incidents that we investigated, 2 serious fires. We also received information about a leak that resulted in the unit continuing to run that we reported to OSHA. But in addition, to respond to points that Brent made that I think are accurate, I would add to that real fundamental change in preventing major accidents, we really have seen historically as what we call a tripartite approach. In other words, it takes not only companies, but it takes regulators and workers all to have an important role and be empowered to prevent accidents from happening. And one important thing that came out of Texas City was not only changes to industry standards, for example, trailer siding, and some of those standards are voluntary, but it also, over time, has led to some advances in regulatory attention as well. At Texas City, it was the first time that the EPA had actually enforced the substantive provisions of their risk management program. OSHA implemented a special emphasis program for oil refineries in the wake of Texas City, and the CSB made recommendations for increased regulatory oversight. And eventually, from the things we learned in Texas City, we made recommendations in another incident where 15,000 people went to the hospital due to a fire at the Chevron Richmond refinery in California. In California, from CSB recommendations, greatly strengthened their process safety and environmental regulations for oil refineries, and really have set a new standard for regulations in the U.S. None of that would have happened if the CSB hadn't focused on those similar issues in the BP Texas City case. So there's a evolution that's occurring where regulatory changes are occurring as a result of, in part, of CSB activity, but that story is not over with. We see some of the regulations being revised in the Trump administration, where RMP regulations are being gutted, and we hope that states like Washington will also follow the example of California.
Yeah, that was my point, is that within the industry, there's an acute level of what I would call recidivism, that you say, okay, trailer siding near a unit's bad. Well, they already knew it's bad. But when a unit blows up and a bunch of people are killed in a trailer, the immediate reaction, if there's a lot of attention drawn to it, which we were able to do, CSB was able to do, is that we better get rid of the trailers. We save money using these trailers. We save money putting them right by the unit, but it looks really bad to do that. And we get a lot of pushback from the employees because now they're aware. And so I'm not getting in that trailer right next to the unit. So that level of pushback gets them out for a while. Now, 10 years down the road, do they start rolling back in? Do people start forgetting about the reason they took them out in the first place? Does a new manager start coming in and who wasn't here then and say, why don't we put these trailers right here by the unit because we'll save money because the guys are working right by it and we don't have that lost time. Why don't we buy the cheap trailers instead of the expensive ones? And so those old cheap habits keep coming back in. And that's why it's important for public policy law firms like mine, CSB, and advocates there to constantly stay vigilant and on every single one of these make as much noise as we can, because otherwise the successes that we do have erode.
One last question. Is the CSB or any other regulatory agency allowed to make unannounced inspections?
The CSB responds to incidents, and it also can conduct hazard investigations. So in the course of a hazard investigation, the CSB would not conduct necessarily an unannounced inspection, but it has the authority to investigate hazards even prior to an incident occurring or an identified issue, or request information from a company to further a study. The dust explosion at Imperial Sugar led to recommendations to OSHA to promulgate regulations related to prevent dust explosions. But that also led to a dust study. There were a number of reactive chemical incidents that have occurred across the country. The CSB did an investigation there and made recommendations. These studies can lead to some fundamental change, and they allow the Chemical Safety Board to broadly examine practices across industry if it identifies a significant problem.
I want to thank you very much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Great job with that animation, by the way. And a great investigation. You too.
Yeah, fantastic.
I understand we have TJ Olds, who was the main editor at the Galveston News, who covered this story from beginning to end. And he's ready to come on the show. So let's bring him on. It is my great pleasure to introduce TJ Olds. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
TJ, you covered this case from start to finish. It's in the news. People can go look it up, find out what happened. But what did you find out, the real dirt on this case?
It was the rumblings we'd heard forever about how dangerous things were at BP, Texas City. You'd heard enough from locals who worked out there over the years, but this case really brought it in a documented form that you saw in writing, black and white, just how serious what had been talked about on a local level, how serious it really was. That was there. That was the biggest thing I think came from all of this. And that's why I think it's commendable to what Eva and Brent did in making sure on the settlement that document after document was released so that the public could see what had been going on in their own backyard for so long.
It's kind of like what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now, where you had all of those hearings in confidential, secret hearings, and then the Republicans wanted them to be released publicly, and now they don't want them to be released.
But yeah, that was a very important factor, and it's rare in litigation of this nature, and that is that the conditions of the settlements that were driven in the case was that all the documents that we had obtained in the litigation became public. That's something that BP didn't want in this case. Companies never really want their dirty laundry aired that way. But we felt it imperative to make that a condition because the public needed to know, the community down there needed to know, and probably most importantly, the rest of the industry and the associations affiliated with those industries could see everything that go on and to hopefully learn from it and avoid some of the same mistakes.
Yeah. As a news investigator and the editor, how difficult was it to get this information?
It so much of it, because it was precluded from public release, was difficult. So the first-hand accounts were the most important parts of these things. What was happening in the court cases? What was happening in the investigations? Remember, we had two sets of investigations going on early on the federal level: the OSHA investigation and the CSB investigation. What was interesting is those two contrasted. OSHA, very quiet until they've released their final report. CSB giving updates over and over and over again on a regular basis. That was, I thought, key, and was the first time I think a lot of folks, particularly in our community, which is a heavy industry town, heard of the CSB ever. They'd heard of the NTSB, but never the CSB. And I think that was vital too, because there were public hearings, there were sessions of taking input. It forced the company as well to come more forward than it normally would have as well, beyond the whole glad handing, hey, we care about your community, we really want to do this. They had to actually be serious and talk, because people were challenging them. They would hear something from investigators, and then they would ask the company. And mind you, we come from a town that is pro-industry. There's not an anti-industry sentiment there, but there is you're here, we're glad about the tax base, but we also want to be safe. So residents were challenging the company too, based on what they were hearing from the CSB. And then as the court cases, even though a lot of them were getting settled, but you were hearing more and more coming out from that as we approached that trial, I should say, that you were hearing more information come out that the public was getting. And so that was a big part of it as well.
Do you remember any particular interview or part of the story that really sticks out in your mind?
It comes from Linda Hunnings, whose husband was killed. And in talking with her, that reinforced some stuff that Brent and I had talked about over some time, but of her husband would come home and say, I don't know why that they have us over in this trailer right next to this other unit that's being worked on. Now, it would seem like a simple thing, but he was even, I don't like to use the term predicting, but he was predicting something bad could happen at the time. And so it was that type of thing. And when that was revealed, and it's an offhanded remark, but when you fast forward what you know after everything happens, I think that was telling, that the evidence was there already that there was something dangerous happening. That in talking with Eva Rowe, talking with her parents, they would have same anecdotal little comments here or there about operations, but nothing was coming of it, because no one was really complaining. The culture wasn't there to complain. The culture wasn't there to report what people thought could be dangerous. The system was always reactive versus proactive. And that also is something that came out. So that interview opened it up to others, where that's why I started asking that question. What did you see before this happened that told you there was something that could be dangerous here?
I've seen I did a case in Reno. Somebody was injured in a casino. Now, the casinos are the big employers in Reno, Nevada.
Sure.
And what the employers often say to the employees, if you're called on a jury, just remember, if you give they say this, if you give a large verdict to something, that might be coming out of your pay. When you're bringing up Texas City, the big employer is petroleum industry down there, and the big employer was BP, right?
Yeah.
Did you ever hear anybody saying, well, if we give them a big verdict, we're going to lose our jobs or something like that?
It always hangs over in the community. This case, a little bit later on, there was a chemical release case in which they became, well, with this lawsuit now the company's just going to sell and move out of town, and we're all going to lose our jobs. That's always was kind of if you want to quote it, the defense of industry in that case. Obviously, that never proves true on there. Things change along the time, but what we found is there is a general concern of, well, if I talk about this in real time, or I talk about it in public, or if a jury trial makes a determination that could hurt a company, they're still going to, they're gonna take our jobs away, or we're gonna lose jobs, and that's always the argument of tort reform, for example, of it's killing jobs. It's the same thing in this case, but you're hearing it because it is an industry town. There is no doubt about it, it's an industry town. The BP case, however, I think changed a lot of people's views in general public. That, yeah, but we got 15 dead people, and
hundreds more injured.
Yeah, and everybody knew somebody who was either killed or injured, and The difference this time around was that type of close connection. Whereas past incidents have happened, there'd be pockets of it's one or two people, and it's always that's too many, but one or two people, and it would be an isolated number of people who knew that particular person or knew that family. This was a totally different case.
Well, it's interesting to note that because we found in the discovery in this case that BP internationally had considered the number of people they killed differently and exponentially in terms of the public relations or branding damage. And we have their documents where if we kill one person 15 different times and therefore have 15 fatalities on our hands, the damage to that from a public relations standpoint was done with a mathematical $1 million or $5 million per person damage, just reputational brand naming damage, and they each added up. But if 15 died at once, it was an exponentially larger number than one at a time because of the attention that's drawn to 15 at one time. So it's actually something they recognize too internally as part of what would happen from a branding standpoint to the company, not just how much they would have to pay people. That usually doesn't change per claim, but how much exponentially larger it'd be if they killed a massive number at one time, which is what TJ's talking about. The community perception of them changed significantly because there had actually been more than 15 fatalities at that plant before this happened.
And that fact that Brent's pointing out actually became public, and it really hit a lot of folks that it really struck them to their core of, wait, this company is valuing the PR value of a death and how much it would cost them in negative PR, and not looking at it as what are we going to do to help whoever was hurt or injured or killed. And that had a big effect.
One last question. I think you were given 7 million pages of documents.
Oh, yes, sir. 7 million.
How long does it take to go through? That's called a
document dump. Yeah,
document dump. And they're hoping you don't go through everything.
Right.
What were some of that was one of the smoking guns you found. How long did it take you to go through?
Here's how we got ahead of it. One is we had a number of people assigned to the review of the documents and put eyes on, downloaded all of them and looked at them, at least cursory look. The other thing that I think helped a lot though is that we were able to scan them all. Computers are pretty cool now. You were able to scan them all and we could word search them. So if we look for any kind of particular document, any kind of particular language, anything about a particular unit or particular issue, we would plug that into the computer and say, give me all the pages that talk about this. And it would pull those out so we could segregate the wheat from the chaff that way in a much better fashion than you could one at a time. The other thing we could do is that when we were getting to witnesses and we want to say, we're deposing this person in management. How many of these meetings did they go to where this was discussed and that was discussed? Well, they're CC'd on all these memos and stuff, so we start doing the word search just for their name. And it allows you to then segregate all those documents into what's really relevant for that time frame. So using today's technology and the equipment that you can obtain now made that process work much more efficiently, and we were able to circumvent the old needle in the haystack deal.
Well, I want to thank you very much for covering the story, and thanks for being here.
Sure. Thank you. Appreciate it.
What are employers required to do in the state of Texas to make their working conditions safe for their employees?
Lately, it's become less and less what the employers actually have to do. Most employers are covered by workers' comp.
In other words, you have workers' comp. I think we've talked about this before. You have workers' comp. You can't sue the company.
You can't. If you work for the company and you get injured, you can't sue the company
unless you're able to prove what.
One is that you're killed, so you can't prove anything. Your family can come back in and prove it. They have to prove that the company acted in a grossly negligent, not just negligence, but almost a malicious intent.
And that's getting back to that arbitrary word. What does that mean exactly, right? And that's when you bring in your experts, right?
Right. But basically, there's a very high threshold to hold an employer accountable for injuring and killing their employees.
As a result of this case, the BP case, what changes did you see in the industry?
Two things. One, the bad thing is that we saw as a result of the interpretation of workers' comp law, most plant owners now have a blanket workers' comp agreement with all the contractors so that they're covered through the plant, and that immunizes them under workers' comp. So that's a negative that we've seen out of it. The better side of it is we've seen, at least for a period of time, and there's always an ebb and flow of what these companies do, but short term, They have generally been more responsive to at least getting trailers out of the facilities, being more aware of the astronomical cost that's associated to major failure. At the end of the day, any monies they don't spend that they need to spend for repairs ends up costing them. I think you'd said before, pay the piper.
Yeah.
You pay them sooner or later. And if you don't take care of the maintenance costs and keeping the equipment running right, sooner or later, when there's a failure, it costs a whole lot more than had you just maintained it properly. And you have the collateral loss of lives and injury as well. It's a lot like running your car. You don't have to change the oil. You don't have to replace brakes. You don't have to replace tires. But you want to spend the money to replace a tire, or you want to wait till you have a blowout. And when you have a blowout, maybe you kill people. Maybe you're just stranded on the side of the road. You got to call a record. You have to do all these other things. The cost of deferring all that always ends up costing a lot more. But these plants operate 1 year at a time, very short-sighted, looking only at that year's profits, not about the long-term consequences of their decision making. And that's what's wrong with the whole industry.
And it doesn't really matter what the year is. If the price of oil is down, then it's too expensive to do the maintenance because they're not making any money. If the price of oil is way up, then it's too expensive to shut down because they could be making a whole bunch of money.
It's always about the money.
Not expensive to do the maintenance, but it is more expensive in the long run, and it hurts people.
Always about the money. And safety and health are secondary to that driver. And that's why this continues to happen.
You know, one last question. When you went into this case, you knew it was a big case.
Oh, yeah.
There were lives lost, hundreds of people injured. I think there were 4,000 lawsuits or something like that.
It damaged properties off-site. It even blew windows out and stuff of people that lived in the neighborhoods around the plant.
Was there ever a time in the 3 years that you were involved with this case and you had to, this cost you a lot of money, you were focused on it?
Oh, we did. We spent millions of dollars developing the case.
Was there ever a point in time when you were worried that this might not end up being the kind of outcome that you got?
Never for a minute.
No.
It's just a matter of proving it.
It's just a matter when we get to the courthouse.
Well, it was, I mean, but by the time we really got into it, it was there. And it just more and more and more evidence mounted against BP. You know, there was a lawyer in the trial that said no one saw this coming. And I just remember that moment because everyone on our side wrote that down because it was patently false. And we knew it was false, and we knew we could prove it 6 ways to Sunday.
Yeah, but it took 3 years.
Yeah.
Well, good work. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on the show. Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.